Do you remember Warhammer 40K Space Marine? This was a third-person action game that had you tearing your way through hordes of orcs and other 40K baddies in what was a high-octane linear adventure that, as far as I remember, a playthrough lasted roughly 6 hours, but boy was it a jam-packed 6 hours. Now the first game released back in 2011, and I thought it was good all the way back then, and honestly, it holds up surprisingly well even today. After seeing the trailers for the upcoming sequel, I decided to jump back in and play it again, and I had a good time. It was just plain fun, smashing through hordes of enemies, playing as the Warhammer equivalent of a demigod. Now enter Space Marine 2. First revealed last year in December 2021, the world premiere trailer was 2 minutes of cinematic that kind of set the stage for what's looking to potentially be a very promising sequel. And yeah, the trailer was pretty good stuff, like lots of cool set pieces, big old gothic 40K backdrops, massive buildings. We saw huge explosions, lots of good action, and some very bassy sounds to the movement and combat, making those Marines feel like the multi-ton behemoths that they are. And then the whole thing wrapped up with a few quick clips of what looked like actual gameplay, albeit it was sans any actual HUD, but clearly in-engine action nevertheless, and it did look pretty good. And can I just say, by the way, how pleased I am to see 40K games getting a bit of a resurgence. I mean, they've really had a comeback. First with Darktide for all of its issues, and it had plenty of them. I still thought it was a solid game, it was a good experience, and I enjoyed my time with it, and it does seem like they're fixing a lot of some of the problems that they had at launch. And now we're getting this, Space Marine 2, I mean, assuming it turns out well, and I really hope it does. And that comes from someone who doesn't even know all that much about 40K. I never really played the tabletop game, I haven't read the books, I don't watch all the out of the cinematics and stuff that are all over the internet with like 10 million views. I don't know too much about 40K, I'm not steeped in that world, but I have played a handful of their games over the years, both good and bad, and for the most part, I've enjoyed them, and I really like the setting. Like, I think it's a cool, fun setting. It's a great space to put a game in, as long as you can make a good game. And the first Space Marine was a good game. It was a short game, but it had some really cool elements to it, and it was just a fun time. I enjoyed playing it. So what I want to do today is dive into Space Marine 2. We're going to talk about everything we know about the game, everything we've learned so far, and what you should come to expect. Right out the gate, I want to just say that it does seem pretty clear that Space Marine 2 will be following in the footsteps of the original in terms of its structure. Taking a look at all of the gameplay that's been revealed so far, it at least appears to work along those same lines, and those lines being, you'll be moving through what's likely handcrafted, fairly linear environments, engaging in a mix of melee and range combat, featuring many of the popular 40K weapons, while fighting back massive groups of enemies. In this case, it looks to be mostly Tyranids. All of this broken up with some storytelling, a bit of environmental traversal, more narrative, and of course, huge set piece moments with artillery raining from the sky, massive explosions, buildings crumbling, and watching endless hordes of enemies pour in all around you. Because remember, in 40K, it is never-ending, bombastic, world-ending battle all over the time. And this is pretty much identical to what the first Space Marine was. Linear, action-packed adventure with some story in the mix. And as I said, the original game ran roughly 6 to 7 hours for a single playthrough, more or less depending on your skill and the difficulty setting, which the first game had 3. Now, how long Space Marine 2 is going to be, it's just guesswork at this point. No information about that. But again, from all of the gameplay clips they revealed, it does appear like the structure, the flow of the game will be very similar. I mean, there may very well be like some more open spaces and more a vertical traversal going on, but for the most part, the first game was incredibly linear. You're moving through corridors and going through these different set pieces and seeing big stuff happening in the background while you're fighting a bunch of enemies, and all of the footage they revealed seems to imply that that's what's happening here. It doesn't look like Space Marine 2 is an open world game by any means. Also from the trailers, it does appear that Space Marine 2 will have many of the same combat elements as the original. So let's go over what those are. In the first game, the combat worked like this. You had a variety of different melee weapons, specifically things like the combat knife, chain sword, power axe, and thunder hammer. Each of these weapons would have their different range and attack patterns that also played into combos. So depending on the number of swings you did, it would chain into combo attacks. And depending on the weapon, this could be anywhere from 2 to 4 combo chains. So if you were using the chain sword and you did one swipe, it was a specific direction. You did a second swipe, it followed it up with a different attack. You kept on going, it ended in like what is kind of like a finisher or just the last bit of the chain before repeating itself again. On top of that, there was these stuns. So you had a single stun ability where if you hit the stun key, it would just do a basic single target light stun, which was good for any of the various types of fodder enemies. However, there were more advanced and varied versions of this stun depending on when you mix them in with a weapon combo chain. So if you did one basic melee attack and then hit the stun button, it would go from the simple slap to a kick, which was actually a medium stun instead of light, and it would be brought out in a small cone, potentially hitting a couple of enemies. However, if you did 2 attacks in a combo chain and then hit the stun button, you would do a shoulder bash, which was called a large stun, in a medium cone. And then finally, if you did 3 attacks followed by a stun, it would end up with some sort of an AoE. This could be either a foot stomp or some sort of overhead smash. What type of stun this would be was just weapon dependent on whatever weapon you were using at the time. And this was called a heavy stun. Again, it would hit in an area all around you. Really good for large groups or very strong enemies. And then that stun played into the execute system, where once an enemy was stunned, you could perform an execute move. It would play out this finisher animation and then restore health. And there were clearly some examples of this in the gameplay footage for Space Marine 2. So it seems pretty obvious that this basis core of combat is going to be in the sequel from what we've seen in the trailer. We've seen what looks to be weapon chain combos, we've seen multiple types of stuns, and we've seen what are quite clearly the executions or the finisher moves. I don't know whether or not it's going to restore health in the sequel, but that's what it did in the original. There was also more to combat, including ranged weapons. The first game had the bolt pistol, bolter, vengeance launcher, and stalker bolter. We have seen additional ranged weapons that will be coming to Space Marine 2. The first game had a grenade toss. You would just spend a grenade, you know what grenades do, and then you could refill these from containers all around the environment. There was also just general ammo refill containers scattered throughout the different levels. Then there was this ultimate system. This was called Fury mode. You would build up your Fury, just engaging in combat. Different weapons would fill different amounts of Fury, and then once full, you could activate it, which just kind of made you super strong after that. There's also dodges and evades in the game, and occasionally jump packs. These were basically level or area specific, where in certain parts of the game, you would get access to a jump pack, and then you could use it to fly around the environment. They had this really cool smash down thing where you just descend from the heavens and make this huge crater, dealing a ton of damage and knocking enemies back. Now again, those were the mechanics in the first game. Through the trailers that they've shown of Space Marine 2, it does seem like most, if not all of this, is coming into the sequel as well. And of course, we hope they expand upon it. We hope they modernize it a little bit. As cool as the first Space Marine was, it does very much so feel like a game that's over 10 years old in terms of its combat. It's very simplistic, and I hope there's a little more nuance to it rather than just 1, 2, 3, 4 clicks for a combo chain for melee, interweaving the various stuns in between. I like that general premise. Action games, third-person action games have come a long way since 2011, and I hope that they can incorporate some more modern-day mechanics into the game. But the basis was pretty sound. Like I said, it was a fun time, and I thought it was good even all the way back then, and still holds up relatively well today. And I'm happy to see that it does appear like they're going to be taking all of this into the sequel. One thing that is clearly improving in Space Marine 2 is much more variety in environments from the original, which was back then pretty much all brown, gray, and metal, with the entire game taking place in what looked more or less to be like an industrial warehouse, which is very 40K as far as I know, but still, it is cool to see that Space Marine 2 will have a bit more location and color variety, some more pops of color here. Don't want it too bright and colorful, of course, it is 40K after all, but oh, and there also just seems to be way more of a sense of scale in the environment, both in terms of the structures, the skybox, these massive buildings, but then also the number of enemies. There just appears to be more of everything, and it all looks way bigger and grander. In fact, the lead gameplay programmer for Space Marine 2 said in an interview with WarhammerCommunity.com that, quote, "The scale of everything is much more epic than its predecessor in every single way." And yes, that seems pretty obvious from what little we've seen of the game so far. After the first announcement trailer for Space Marine 2 came out, like I said, last December in 2021, things went pretty quiet for a while up until early June when they released this 2 5-minute developer blog, which can really just be summed up by saying they respect the 40K universe, they're all big fans, they know they have a lot to live up to, and they're gonna do their best to try to create a really great game. There was really very little actual game details discussed in here. Shortly after that, though, in mid-June, during the PC Gaming Show, we got a 5-minute developer interview. They opened up discussing how influential 40K has been over the years, specifically noting that the original Doom guy was modeled after a Space Marine. And they're not wrong, by the way. The Warhammer universe was the basis for a ton of popular franchises, including literally all of Warcraft and StarCraft. These are essentially Blizzard's version of the Warhammer and Warhammer 40K universe. In fact, they started out quite literally as that. Like, Blizzard was trying to make a Warhammer game. They couldn't get the rights to it, so then they made Warcraft and StarCraft. That is like the history of those franchises. It's kind of crazy to think, but yes, Warhammer, very influential, still remains quite popular to this day. There were a few game-specific details in here as well. For one, they revealed that the Tyranids will be the main enemy in Space Marine 2. We kind of got that sense from the trailers, but it's good to get specifics here. And they mentioned that their game engine is able to support massive numbers of them, specifically saying that we will have thousands of Tyranids to fight. I mean, thousands on screen at once, or thousands in the whole game. I don't know. Does it matter? Not really. They also said that combat in Space Marine 2 will be a mix of in-your-face melee along with some really cool over-the-top weapons, which, as we touched on earlier, this was basically the same for the first game. And then they mentioned the whole flow of combat, which is like that never stop, always move forward action would be returning as well, because yes, Space Marine is not a cover shooter. This ain't no Gears of War. You're just going, slashing, crashing through enemies, and having stuff blow up all the way around you. So as cool as all of this stuff is, a lot of this is really focused on like the single player campaign. And I know for probably a lot of people that's going to be the main focus, but I want to know more about the multiplayer, because the original Space Marine had multiplayer. This included a co-op horde mode and competitive PvP. The horde mode was pretty simple. This was called Exterminatus and tasked teams of 4 with holding back waves of enemies on 2 levels that each had multiple stages. But then there was the PvP. This was small scale 8 vs 8 battles for objectives. There was Deathmatch, where the first team to 41 kills would win, and then Domination, where the teams would fight for control of various capture points. Players could customize the appearance of their Space Marine. There was also a class system, letting you select from some pre-established classes, or customize your own loadout, choosing from various combinations of weapons, consumables, and perks. And the whole thing was really cool. I thought the multiplayer was a super fun addition to what was otherwise considered just a single player romp. And this was actually a fairly common practice back then for many otherwise single player focused games to get this, what was called back then, tacked on multiplayer. And it sounds reductive, and I think in a lot of ways it is, especially because for the most part, I enjoyed a ton of these. Tons of games, especially in the early to mid 2010s that did this, and that kind of has fallen by the wayside. I miss it, and I wish games would do it more often nowadays, instead of just reserving any multiplayer take on whatever game franchise for a live service game, which is what seems to just happen nowadays. I mean, look what they did with the Last of Us 2. Instead of returning the multiplayer factions mode, or even instead of bringing multiplayer factions mode into the remaster of the first Last of Us, which was in the original game, they just said, hey, we're gonna spin this off into its own thing. It feels sometimes slapped together, but a lot of times I end up having a lot of fun with this stuff. I guess that's my point. So for Space Marine 2, will this be getting multiplayer? As of now, there's been no official confirmation one way or the other. However, according to this image from the PlayStation Store, it does appear like the game will support online play with up to 12 players, which would imply 6 vs 6 competitive modes. It's kind of odd because the original game had 8 vs 8. Not that 2 extra players per team is gonna make or break things, and likely they're kind of choosing player count based on things like balance and map size and performance of the game with the number of players. Hey, selfishly, I would like to see even larger scale. Like, just imagine 40 vs 40, where you got a bunch of squads of Space Marines going around in this huge map, kind of like a 40K take on Battlefield. That would be really fun. I would really enjoy it. I don't assume that's what's happening here. If we take this image at face value, yes, it looks like it is going to be 6 vs 6. But whatever the size or whatever the player count, this does seem to confirm that Space Marine 2 should be getting competitive multiplayer again, which makes me happy to hear. I also hope, of course, that the Horde mode co-op returns as well, because that was also pretty cool. So when can we play? Well, as of now, Space Marine 2 is slated to release at some point in 2023. There have really been no details beyond that. I suspect we will get a more specific window, whether that's like Q3 or Q4. We'll probably learn about that in the coming months here. Do want to mention as well, even though we don't have like a release date or even a release quarter, they're already selling the collector's edition. Buying this gets you a resin statue of Titus fighting a Tyranid. Well, not really fighting, ripping him in half. There's also a 64-page hardcover book, a steel book, which comes with physical copies of the game for consoles or a code for PC, along with access to the first DLC, which they of course already have planned. All of that for the low price of $250. Hey, you know what? Whatever people want to do with their money, and clearly they know their market. Warhammer fans are no stranger to spending hundreds of dollars on resin statue figurines of characters. That's part and parcel for what Warhammer is, really. So there you go. That is what we know so far about Space Marine 2. It is kind of light on details, but it's been pretty clearly, they've painted a pretty clear picture, even from the brief amount of clips and gameplay that they've shown so far. Expect a linear adventure. I'll guess 7 to 10 hours duration. That's a complete guess though, shot in the dark. Hopefully we get the co-op horde mode, and it does appear confirmed that we will be getting the competitive multiplayer. Sounds good, looks good. One of the many games I'm looking forward to playing in 2023. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.